Hi everybody. Welcome to Biology with Bernstein and Butterscotch, because every hardworking science student deserves a chance at an A. I'm Professor Phoebe, the narrator. My dogs Bernstein and Butterscotch have some tips to help you get an A. This movie is an overview of making science graphs using Excel. We'll look at why professors are so picky about formatting and how science and Excel don't always speak the same language, which can make it unnecessarily difficult to get an A on your lab reports. We science professors are picky because it's our job to hold you to high standards, but it's also our job to help you reach those standards. That's the point of these videos. We ask you to write lab reports similar to the style that we use in our own scholarly research papers. But we also ask you to write lab reports, and especially figures and tables, in a certain way, because form and content must reinforce each other. A good scientific paper is like a well-crafted poem. When we ask you to follow detailed directions to write a lab report, we are asking you to do something like what it takes us to write a professional research article. This is an excerpt of just a small part of the professional directions to authors just to make a single figure for publication. Now, we don't expect undergraduates to be able to take in this much detail just yet, but we are doing our best to help you move from being a student to being a scientist. But the second reason we are so picky is even more important. Just like DNA illustrates that form and function are interrelated in nature, the form of a lab report is essential for its role in science communication. This silly poem also demonstrates this point. After the lab has been cleaned up, your faces, I hope, ought to light up. Yes, benchwork is fun, but once it is done, the problem, of course, is the write-up. If you change the rhyming pattern, the content, or the form, the poem just isn't funny. It isn't functional anymore. If your lab reports aren't in the right form, they just can't earn an A. Next, we're going to tell you about how students using Excel to make graphs and tables for their lab reports might not realize that there is yet another reason it can be hard to get an A on lab reports. The fact is that science and Excel don't always speak the same language. There are three major differences between science and Excel that can be confusing. First, in biology, it's very common to need a bar graph, where there are categories on the x-axis and numerical values on the y-axis. But in Excel, this kind of graph is called a column chart. Excel has something called a bar graph, but that is not the same thing at all. Second, in the sciences, it is common for your professor to ask you to make a line graph, where there are numerical values on both the x-axis and the y-axis, and you can calculate an equation to fit the line. But in Excel, this kind of graph is called an XY or scatter plot. Once again, Excel has something that it calls a line chart, but the Excel line chart is completely wrong for lab reports. Third, most scientists call the graphical description of the colors and symbols on a graph the key. In contrast, Excel calls this same thing a legend. This wouldn't be such a big deal, except that many science professors use the word legend to mean something else. We mean the caption, starting with the figure number, followed by a title, and a descriptive text. In contrast, you can't really use Excel to write a nice caption. So remember, when a science professor says key, she means this part of the figure. When she says legend, she usually means the text caption that has to be added under the figure once you have finished making the rest of the graph. Don't let Excel fool you into thinking that you have provided a legend when instead your graph just has a key. That wraps up this overview of using Excel to write lab reports. Next up in this series, how to use Excel to make wonderful graphs for lab reports. Feel free to leave comments here or on Twitter at Prof. Phoebe. Subscribe to Biology with Bernie and Butterscotch, because everyone who works hard should have the chance at an A.